Morning, 6th grade. Welcome to lesson 1 on science class today. In your book, you should be on page 6, and on page 7 is where we have the title. And then underneath the title, there's always a little statement that's kind of like a summary statement for the lessons we're going to have today. It says, Earth is home to millions of different living things. A large number of living things have not yet been discovered. So as we work through the lesson today, we'll see a lot of evolution in our science book, and as we try to connect some of the things we're talking about in history class, like drawing conclusions and making inferences and looking for evidence, we're going to see that a lot in our science book as well, and we're going to start to use the critical skills that we need to see what we as Christians believe compared to the conclusions they have drawn based on their evidence. I'll start with the biosphere. It says, you probably know that living things are on almost every type of land, and also deep in the oceans and high in Earth's atmosphere. You may think that the area where things live is large, but if you could shrink Earth to the size of an apple, the area in which things can live would be less than the thickness of the apple's skin. You have the blank for number 1 filled in. The part of the Earth that can support living things is called the biosphere, number 2. Living things and their environments make up the biosphere. The biosphere has many different environments, such as deserts, oceans, fields, beaches, backyards, and the sidewalks of the busiest streets. Okay, so the first concept they want you to do is, hey, when I look at the Earth, I say, man, the Earth is huge, and there are living things everywhere, so living things cover a huge part. Where my brain says that makes sense, what science is saying is, not really. When you think of the Earth, everything inside the Earth, as I start to dig down into the Earth a few miles, I'm not going to find any living things. They can't survive inside the Earth a few miles. There's not enough light, oxygen, things like that. So I go to the deepest oceans. The deepest oceans are about 5 miles thick. Yep, there's living things down there, but the oceans end after 5 miles. Up into the sky, same thing. Yeah, we have birds in the air, but when I get up into space outside our Earth's atmosphere, there isn't living things up there. There's no oxygen. So when I go from the sky where birds can live down to the bottom where fish live, that is not that much area compared to the whole thing. So as you start to work assignments in your science book, if you maybe have your assignments sitting out there in front of you and you're looking at some of those things, make sure you are taking what your science book is trying to teach you when you look at that worksheet. So there'll be a true-false question today that says something like, hey, the area of the Earth where living things are is large. No, it's not. It's really small. It's less than the thickness of an apple. If I would say, hey, eat the skin of an apple, you wouldn't say, man, I ate almost the whole apple. You'd say, I barely ate anything. And so that's what they're trying to teach you. There's a word for that. It means sphere is a circle. So they're saying you have the shape of Earth, and that's where life can live. The last thing I want to point out is in the last paragraph is what you wrote for number 3. The biosphere has many different environments. Usually when I think of environments, I start with the first 2 on that list. Deserts and oceans, like big, huge areas of land. But as we kept reading that sentence, they said all the way down to the busiest sidewalks. So a biosphere, when I'm talking about it, or environment, can be very, very small, to my backyard, to just what's living in the crack in the sidewalk, from the weeds to the bugs to the things like that there that we have. Paragraph at the bottom of the page says, scientists have discovered and named nearly 2 million different organisms in Earth's biosphere. Even so, scientists think that million more organisms have not been discovered. So as I talked about when we started this thing, this is one of those things where we have to decide if you think that's true. So we've named millions of different organisms, but do we believe that there might be millions out there that we haven't named? The next paragraph will tell us why they believe that. Why are there so many living things still unknown? Some parts of the Earth have not been well studied. Example number 1, Earth's deep oceans. Number 2, polar areas. 3, dense rainforests. And 4, vast deserts are just some of these areas which we still have a lot to learn. Reason number 2 why we might have some unknown. Also, many of Earth's organisms are very tiny and would be hard to find. So what they're saying is, hey, there might be a ton of things swimming. You would know in the depths of the ocean, if there is something swimming there, is drop a submarine down there, turn on its bright lights, and pray that something swims right by it that we can take a picture of. Well, if I live in the bottom of the ocean as a fish, I'm not used to bright lights, so I probably won't swim right next to a machine that's got a bright light on it because it's not normal to my environment. And so what they're saying is you take this huge, vast ocean, and we have no idea. And then the other regions, I don't want to, sit up there and freeze in Antarctica or in the polar regions to see if something walks by that I've never seen before, or in a dense rainforest, which is dense, it's hard to travel through. Then you combine that with looking for different bugs or something really small. Think how hard that would be to sit in a forest and wait for bugs to walk by you and say, have I ever seen that bug before, or did I discover a new species? So their evidence that says we might not have discovered millions of species might make sense and be true. We have no way to prove that, obviously. The last paragraph. Each organism in the biosphere interacts with other organisms and the environment to produce a web of interactions. Humans, too, play an important part in this changing web. Because all parts of the web are connected, a small change in one part can produce a large change in another part. And it's a good reminder for us to keep that in mind. On your notes now, you've worked all the way through number 8. It's a true statement. Sometimes when we read that, we think about it as a negative statement, like if you make one change here, you're going to ruin everything. It's not necessarily negative. Okay, humans live on this earth. The Lord told us to do this. The Lord, told us rule over the animals. And so to do that, we're going to have to build homes. To do that, we're going to have to clear land. And when we clear land, we're taking away habitats for animals. That doesn't mean all the animals are going to die. Animals can move. What he is saying is, I want you to be good stewards of that. Make wise decisions. Don't be wasteful. Don't be polluting. You think about the streets of Milwaukee and how we just throw trash out windows. That's what they're talking about. That's an interaction. That's a change in the web. That's not beneficial. That's us not taking care of the earth that we're supposed to be taking care of. And so we got to make sure we're doing the things that God has asked us to do. Okay, 6, lots of times I just read these paragraphs and to discuss it with you. There's obviously a lot of pretty fun pictures there. I highly recommend that you glance at those beautiful pictures, read the descriptions on those things. It adds a lot more to the things there and is very fun and interesting. I'm going to turn the page and we move on with the different variety that's out there. The variety among living things says this. If your class wrote the names of the different organisms that each student knows, imagine how long that list would be. But your list would be very small compared to all the known organisms on our planet. Earth has an amazing variety of living things. These organisms have many different body plans and structures. These differences make it possible for organisms to live in almost every place on Earth. Look at the plants and animals pictured on these pages. They are all alike in some ways. For example, they all are made of cells. They all organisms are also very different. The differences enable each kind of organism to survive in its particular environment. A characteristic that enables an organism to survive and reproduce in an environment is called an adaptation. For example, the spines of the cactus, pictured at the top of the page, are actually modified leaves. Their shape helps stop water loss from the plant. They also protect the cactus from being eaten. The thick, fleshy stem of a cactus can store a lot of water, which is an important adaptation for a plant that grows in such a dry environment. As you look at the other pictures on these pages, think about how these organisms' adaptations helps it survive in its environment. So adaptation, characteristic that helps it survive and reproduce. When God created everything in Genesis chapter 1, he always ended it now, be fruitful and multiply. Told the plants, produce seeds, told the animals, be fruitful. And they listen to God, they carry that out. And so an adaptation is anything that has helped a plant carry out God's calling to reproduce and to survive in its environment. So they gave you the example of the cactus, which obviously lives in a dry desert climate. And they say, how are you going to survive there? Well, you have modified leaves, so you don't lose water, you can store water, you have the spines so that animals don't come up to it and eat it. All those things are adaptations. And adaptations constantly happen. We'll spend a whole chapter talking about different adaptations that are out there. But God in his wisdom said, no matter where an organism lives, whether it's in a cold polar region, a hot, dry desert, ocean, I'm going to adapt it to survive there because I obviously want living species to be able to thrive. It's why I made it. So as you were following along with there, you took out notes for 9, 10, and 11. I'll finish up there on the bottom of 8 and the top of page 9. It says, although there's a great variety among organisms, some group of organisms share many of the same characteristics. These organisms may be members of the same species. A species is a group of very similar organisms whose members can mate with one another and produce offspring that are able to produce offspring. For example, the horses in the photo are members of the same species. Each species has a two-part scientific name. The scientific name for a horse is Equus caballus. Continuing on the top of the next page, like the horses below, individuals in the same species often don't look exactly alike. In fact, they can be different in many ways: size, color, shape, but they do share similar body plans and structures. As you see from the chart, the number of species for different kinds of organisms is very large. The chart, however, only includes the species that have been identified and live today. Some scientists think that 99% of all species that have ever lived on Earth no longer exist. Most of them have left no fossil evidence that they lived. Okay, so I'm going to start back with the definition you have of a species. A species is a kind of a goofy definition there because it says a group of, number one, they're going to be very similar. They're not exact, that was the next paragraph, but they're very similar, who they can mate and reproduce with. But to be considered that, they have to have the next generation also able to reproduce. Now the reason they're doing that is science is starting to mess with animals. We have figured out how to clone animals. We figured out how to put certain animals together. I think an example that might come to mind is a liger, where they take an animal and a tiger and they put it together and they produce a liger. But ligers can't produce more ligers that continue to produce more ligers. So we're saying, hey, that's kind of like a science messing with animals. And until that happens naturally and they continue on, they're not a new species. Okay, so the reason the definition is the way it is to say what's happening naturally in this world. Tigers produce tigers, which produce tigers, which produce tigers. Humans produce humans, which produce humans. Humans is a species. Now on the top of page 9, they're saying, hey, you're a species, you're similar, you're not identical. Sizes, shapes, all those things are true. We belong to the same species, but we are not exactly alike. Okay, the last paragraph, once again, was scientists drawing conclusions. If you're a critical reader, you're going to say, that's science supporting evolution. We think we've only identified 1% of the living things. We think 99% of all living things are dead now and left no fossil evidence. Well, that's because science says the Earth is millions and billions of years old, so there had to be things that lived millions and billions of years ago, and they just died and were eliminated from this Earth with no fossil evidence. Okay, so as a Christian, I'm going to read that statement and say, do I believe there were living things that have died and are not on this planet anymore? You bet. Okay, think of the dinosaurs. We have some physical evidence of dinosaurs. We've discovered bones and footprints and things like that. But they're not walking around today. So they have been eliminated, but because we find certain things, they're out there. Do I think there were millions of different types of dinosaurs, all that got eliminated from this earth without leaving a fossil? No, I don't think God in his wisdom is going to do that to us. Okay, so we just need to be careful with that. The last thing I want to do is number 15. It says, look at that chart. You can see vertebrates are animals with backbones. There are a total of 42,000 of them, and then they break those 42,000 into the categories of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. Then there are invertebrates, which are animals without backbones. These would be your bugs, your worms, things like that. There's almost 1 million of those, 980,000. And then you compare that to plants, and you have 248,000 plants. I'm sorry for the sneeze. Plants that have been named and identified by us. Now there's obviously more things like that as we start to talk about the 2 million. That's just plants and animals that they named. As we move on to the next lesson, you'll talk about protists, bacteria, fungi, things like that. So if you're doing math, you're saying, Ms. Bauer, that doesn't add up to 2 million. You are absolutely correct. We still have a few more categories that we need to talk about. Today just gets us started on what living things are so that we can then in the next lessons talk about how we classify those into the different groups, which is the point of our lesson today. On your worksheet, 6th grade, you can see you have on the top 3 vocabulary words to put in with their definitions, and then I think you have 5 true and falses. If you want extra credit, like I showed you on that worksheet, that bottom question is always a challenge question. That can be done for extra credit if you'd like. Have a good day.